Today, I want to talk about the power of rethinking. Thinking again. I don't know precisely how to say that in the best way, but I want to talk about why it's so important to question your assumptions about things. And we're going to be looking at this from sort of two different ways. We're going to be looking at it from both the creative side, and we're going to be looking at it from the business side. This is a channel dedicated to authors. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author, and I've written 30-some books, published most of them. I make my full-time living just writing books, and I have for the last few years. I make these videos just to share what I know with the community, and I hope that they can help you. Before we dive into this idea of rethinking or questioning your assumptions, I want to talk about why we typically don't. There's a lot of research around bias, especially confirmation bias, which is the tendency that humans have to assume that something that they believe is true, even when evidence is presented against it. When you look at a body of evidence, you're more likely to see evidence if it supports what you already believe. And this is partially because we're lazy. We don't like to think. Thinking is hard. And so our brains default to not thinking as much as possible. And so if you have a strongly held belief, for instance, you think that cilantro tastes like soap, then you are going to look for evidence that suggests cilantro does taste like soap, and therefore you are not going to have to change your opinion. You're not going to have to think about it. You're just going to be fine. I did not realize that cilantro did not taste like soap to some people, and it really confused me for a very long time. But maybe in your life, you don't eat cilantro or you've never experienced that. You can think of your own example of confirmation bias. Now, as a creative, this becomes doubly difficult. And it becomes doubly difficult because our confirmation bias is about a subjective thing. It's one thing if you can concretely prove that something is false, right? If a claim is falsifiable, then it's easier to accept that new information and to avoid your confirmation bias. But when something is entirely subjective, then it becomes much more difficult. So for instance, if we say cilantro tastes like soap, that's falsifiable. Some people will say, yes, myself included, cilantro does taste like soap. Other people will say, no, cilantro does not taste like soap. Therefore, we can determine that cilantro does not always taste like soap, but it does sometimes taste like soap. It just depends on who's eating it. But it's much harder when we say this is a good story or this is not a good story. And I'm not talking about things like grammar. There are certain objective standards that determine whether or not a story or a novel is good. But above a certain standard, everything becomes entirely subjective. It becomes even worse when we start to ask questions about the story. Were the characters' actions in this story correct or incorrect? Well, it all depends on what you mean by correct. Or you might say, should the story have ended the way it did? Fans all over the world will have drastically different opinions on that question. Now, you might say, well, Seth, everybody's got their own opinions, so just let people make what they want to make. There's a danger to that. And that's because as creatives, we can become creatively tunnel visioned. Because we are constantly looking for information that supports what we already believe, if you are writing a story and you have an idea in your head as to how the story should progress, how it should go, then chances are that you are going to look for information that confirms that idea. The problem is, and I unfortunately see this all the time, that creatives will often make a creative choice, double down on that choice, resist any information that would tell them that that's the wrong choice, and then they suffer because of it. There's some really interesting research that suggests that the more certain you are about an answer, the more likely you are to be wrong. And this isn't just anecdotal, this is actual scientific, peer-reviewed research. The study in question was examining tests where they counted the number of eraser marks next to problems, and they discovered that the people who had the most eraser marks typically got the highest scores. And on top of that, the majority of the answers that were changed were correct, whereas it was much more likely for somebody to get a wrong answer if they didn't change any answers on their test. Again, this seems so backwards to us, but it's objectively true. The more certain we are of a particular answer, the more likely we are to be wrong. The more likely we have not considered all of the alternatives. The more likely we're missing information. So on the creative side, being able to shift your story based on new information, or shift your story based on feedback, or shift your story based on having a second and better idea is unbelievably helpful. Because the reality is that your first instinct, my first instinct, when we're writing a story, probably isn't the best option. If you are describing a bar fight, let's say you have a fantasy setting and your heroes are in the bar and enemies attack. The first way you think about having them deal with the enemies is probably not the most creative, most fun, most interesting way they could do it. And if you spent more time examining that scene and thinking of creative out-of-the-box solutions for your characters, you could probably write a better scene. And see, we all know this. We all know this sort of instinctively, that if we were to spend more time being creative, that we would get better results. But because we have this sort of creative tunnel vision, it becomes incredibly hard for us to make that shift, to move to a different way of writing or a different kind of scene. One of the interesting phenomena that sort of exemplifies this for me is how often I'll be writing a story and I'll think that I understand the motivations of a character, and then all of a sudden I'll get to a certain point and their motivation shifts. And they do something unexpected. And I realize, aha, I had their motivation wrong. They actually have something else in mind. This is one of the most satisfying things you can do for a reader, to provide that moment of pleasant surprise. It can be a powerful tool for moving a reader emotionally. So as much as possible, we want to avoid creative tunnel vision. But there's a more practical reason that we might want to rethink the things that we're doing. And that's that books that succeed in the marketplace are typically books that appeal to other people more than they appeal to the author. This is one of the hardest things to talk about objectively as a creator. Because often the things that we want to create have a fairly small audience. And if we are so committed to our own creative vision for what it is we want to create, then often other people simply cannot relate to it. And if they can't relate to it, they're not going to buy it. And if they don't buy it, well, there goes our livelihood. And so there's a tremendous amount of value in being able to rethink our stories in a way that makes them more accessible to a wider audience. I'm not saying that we should, throw away our creativity and sell out, but it is important, if you want to be a full-time author, if you want to make a living writing books, it's incredibly important that you understand how to appeal to a wide group of people. And so committing ourselves so completely to singular ideas doesn't give us the breadth we need in order to reach all of those different readers. On the other hand, if you can take your core idea and you can add to it by accepting other people's feedback, by shifting the specifics of the details by being willing to get out of this creative tunnel vision and branch out and explore into new territory. Often we can create something that fits our initial conception, that is true to our creative spark, but also is accessible and interesting for other people. And when we can do that, that's when we can find success. That's when people will be willing to put money, which is very important. That's when people will be willing to put money behind their interest. Anyway, I feel like I've ranted a little bit, and that's kind of par for the course. If you're new to these videos, welcome to Rant City, because that's what I like to do. If you have any specific topics that you'd like to hear me talk about, then definitely leave them in the comments below. Hope you've gotten something out of this video, and thanks for watching.